Dampness. Everything smelled damp and musty, rancid meat and blood. The smell of blood was the strongest, foul, suffocating, and heavy. The smell of fear mingled with it, the smell of wild terror and death. It was he who possessed two victims, girls who were not guilty of anything. They were both sitting on the floor, their hands cuffed to the wall above their heads. No escape. It was dark all around, and the smell alone enveloped them and made them panic. In this darkness, they couldn't see each other and could only talk. Their voices were trembling and choked with sobs, terrifying, painful, and nauseating. The latch rattled deafeningly in the silence, followed by the rattle of a chain, the turn of a key in the lock, and the loud, nasty creak of a heavy metal door. The dim yellow light only served to dispel the darkness a little, but, as luck would have it, it didn't illuminate the face of the newcomer. The door closed, and it was dark again, and the girls were shivering and pressing harder against the damp, cold wall. It was as if they were waiting for the wall to collapse and escape from this nightmare. But no, that was just the beginning, like the introduction to a horror book. The man pressed the switch, waiting patiently for the lights to stop blinking and come on normally. He didn't have to wait long, grinning as he walked over to the girls, sizing them up for a long time. He liked the first one better, with black hair and brown eyes, and a few moles on her right cheek that he wanted to cut off with a knife and pepper. Her slightly plump body with full breasts made me lick my lips. After all, so many dishes can be made from this appetizing body with dark skin. He liked the other girl less. She was thin, with small, barely noticeable breasts and pale skin. Her gray eyes didn't appeal to him, and he wanted to tear them out and stomp on them so they wouldn't look at anyone else. Her slightly greasy brown hair was disgusting, and her straight nose wanted to be broken and cut off. Feed it to the rats who tried to keep a low profile in his presence. But he needed to prepare everything he needed for tonight's feast. The brown-haired woman was afraid to move and sobbed softly, all the mascara smeared on her cheeks. She'd never felt so scared before, and he was looking at her with a cold, pitiless stare, as if he wanted to destroy her. His whole appearance was frightening, especially his face, which was unshaven and wrinkled like a 40-year-old man. But it wasn't that was frightening, but the fact that the entire left side of his face was decorated with a burn and a mark from the animal's claws. He had a blindfold over one eye, and his red curly hair was tangled and hung in clumps on his forehead. His physique was large and strong, as if he had been practicing martial arts all his life. They can't escape from such a maniac. "Vika, I'm scared." The brunette turned to her and cried. "I'm also afraid, Asya. I do not know if we will be able to free ourselves and leave. Are you still talking?" Annoying. With that, he picked up a small penknife from the table and walked over to Vika. He narrowed his eyes at the girl's frightened face and smiled a wild, predatory smile. Victor abruptly grabbed her chin and pressed his fingers to her cheekbones, forcing her mouth open. It was useless to resist. She couldn't reach with her hands, and her body ached badly. All she could do was flutter like a dehydrated butterfly. While her mouth was open, he grabbed her tongue with his fingers, but the sharp pain caused him to let go. She bit two of his fingers, but it didn't bleed, and she didn't have time to tighten her jaw. Vika did not even understand anything when a deafening pain first appeared on her cheek and then on her temple. My head was pounding and my ears were ringing. My mouth tasted like blood and a couple of broken teeth. She couldn't spit them out, just pushed them out with the blood running down her chin. Her cheek was gradually swollen and turning a bluish color, and the impact against the wall made it hard for her to think straight. Asya screamed next to him and twitched like a madwoman, making this maniac laugh, and he enjoyed it. The screams, the futile attempts to get out of his bonds. All this amused him, and to the lovely tune he took Vicky's tongue out of his mouth again. Holding it tightly outside, he smiled, and with a quick flick of his hand, cut it off. The soft flesh between her fingers, the warm, dripping blood, and that delicious cry of pain. He had been waiting for this for a long time. He had already missed this sight. The brunette continued to squeal and squint at him, as if expecting an attack. But he wasn't in a hurry. Victor slowly put his tongue in his mouth, licking the blood from his fingers. Just the delicious sweet taste of young blood. Slightly harsh meat, but after a few seconds of testing, it becomes softer and tastier, as if there was a filling in the tongue that was worth getting to. He didn't care if the victim died of shock, but he didn't want her to choke. So, grabbing her bangs, he tilted her face forward, letting the blood run down to the floor and her legs. She was losing consciousness. She needed to hurry. Asya pressed herself against the wall and shook, unable to move, unable to say anything, unable to call out to her. All he could see was her hanging upside down from the handcuffs, still breathing. His eyes were closed, and a red liquid was constantly flowing out of his mouth, mixing with his saliva. It was disgusting, and monstrous. There is no way out of this small room with one table, tiles, and a cabinet in which there were cutlery. Then everything was a blur, and she lost consciousness when she saw what he was doing. This monster used a red-hot knife to cut her wrists and cut the tendons on her legs. After removing the handcuffs, the bastard cut off her fingers right down to the knuckles. And he put the fingers themselves in Asa's hands and laughed. Then the girl no longer remembered anything, losing consciousness and feeling finally nauseous. Victor dragged the victim to the table, and with a couple of deft movements threw it there. For safety's sake, he chained her hands and feet to the table legs, enjoying the view. The girl was lying on her back on the table. Her arms were dislocated and chained, and her legs were also chained. He cut up the clothes and threw them on the floor. Still, he liked the fact that the victim's pubis was shaved and did not cause disgust. I wanted to eat unbearably. It is not easy to eat, but to enjoy such a wonderful meal. Placing the cups at the victim's shoulders, he picked up a knife and slowly made an incision from the chin to the end of the pubic area. The incision turned out to be smooth and deep, because of which the victim woke up and began to squirm. She developed adrenaline, but this only worsened the situation, namely, Victor simply slammed his hands into her abdomen, grabbing at the edges of her skin and suddenly tearing it apart. The sound of skin tearing and a wild death cry. The victim is dead, and the eyes only look at the ceiling. Her intestines began to cool, and after spitting somewhere to the side, the cannibal carefully pulled them out and threw them on the floor. The organs that were still more or less suitable for him to eat, he put in cups. And everything else he dumped on the floor: bile, lungs, intestines, bladder, uterus, and ovaries. All of this was scattered around the table and gave off an unpleasant smell. Victor was pleased when he saw it empty, and the bowls full of delicacies that he could eat. Now it's a small matter, butchering her body and putting it in the freezer. Asya regained consciousness from the disgusting smell. When she opened her eyes, a monstrous picture appeared to her. Seconds of realization and a wild squeal that made the monster laugh. Guts were strewn around the table, and Vika was lying on the table gutted all over. It was terrible when your friend was dead and you were chained up, unable to escape or help her. All she could do was sit quietly and wait for her fate. Watching this monster slash her friend and eat her meat is disgusting and scary. And he did not stop. He was pleased with the fact that finally there was an audience who would die later. Her cry and soft cry were like balm to his soul. Occasionally stealing glances at the brunette, he continued his task. He decided to start with the victim's head, first cutting off the scalp so that the bare white skull was visible. Next to the face he hated, he simply cut off the skin with rags so that there was not a single piece of meat on the skull. Ears, cheeks, temples, occipital skin, muscles, everything was cut clean off. All that remained was a skull with eyes, but he had carefully gouged out the eyes as well. He didn't feel like eating them anymore, so he tossed them to the other victim so she could get enough of them. Victor cleaned himself up, feeling full and satisfied. The second victim's body was cut into pieces and placed in black bags, which he had stowed away in his Gelänwagen. No one has yet recognized him. No one has been able to find his trail. No one will ever know him. He's a genius. He's a monster. He's a cannibal.